Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Isaac Prilleltensky, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I'm thrilled to have you here, and we're going to get right into it. But before we do, maybe you can just take a moment to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your connection to the topic of meaningful work.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew. It's a real pleasure always to be with you. I guess I came to the topic of meaningful work both through scholarly and practical interests. Most recently, up until a couple of years ago, I was vice provost for institutional culture at the University of Miami, which meant improving the climate for 17,000 employees. And prior to that, I was dean of the School of Education and Human Development for almost 12 years. So I had a lot of practical experience trying to improve the well-being of employees through meaningful work. And most recently, through a scholarly interest in the topic of mattering and mattering at work. So I'm sure we'll get into that in a few moments. But these are the two angles, really, that led me to this topic.
Tell us a little bit about mattering. What does mattering in life mean? What does mattering at work mean?
So mattering is quite simply defined by two complementary experiences: feeling valued and adding value. So by feeling valued, we mean being seen, recognized, respected, appreciated. And by adding value, we mean making a contribution, either to yourself, to your workplace, or family, or the community in general. So when you think about feeling valued and adding value in different domains of life, work is a very prominent domain of life. We spend a lot of time and effort and energy and thought and passion and commitment at work to work. So feeling valued and being able to add value at work are essential predictors of well-being at work. So in a study we conducted, not necessarily in the workplace, but in general, to see what's the relationship between mattering and well-being and justice. What we found was that justice has a big impact on well-being. The more you experience conditions of justice in the community, at work, the higher your well-being is. So this is what we call a direct effect. But most of the impact of justice on well-being is mediated through the feeling of mattering. So what really improves well-being is feeling valued and having an opportunity to add value. When it comes to work, it's being recognized for your efforts and being given opportunities for leadership, given responsibility, a meaningful role, creating a safe space so that people can experiment with innovation without feeling the fear of potential retribution or punishment if they make a mistake. So when you look at the vast literature on engagement at work, and there are multiple instruments to measure engagement at work, the famous Gallup U12 and Schaufeli and Tower Watson. There are really quite a number of engagement tools to measure how people feel connected, tied to their work. almost to the last item, all these instruments measure one of two things. Are you feeling valued at work? And do you have an opportunity to add value at work?
Hmm.
Do you feel valued by your peers? Do you feel valued by your boss? Do you feel valued by your employees? Do you feel valued by yourself? And do you have an opportunity to apply your strengths, to assume more challenging positions that will enable flow at work? So there is a lot of convergent evidence that these two aspects of mattering are really crucial at work.
What do you think is the relationship between mattering and meaning?
I think that meaning is an activity, a belief, a behavior, a thought, a commitment in the service of mattering.
Hmm.
So the ultimate goal is to have significance in life, to have a worthy life. And the way we do that is by engaging in meaningful activities, contributing to a social cause, contributing to your family, to your own personal development. Maybe you find meaning in becoming the best violinist in the world, or the best soccer player, or a great surgeon, or just a good friend.
Hmm.
And people find meaning in commitments that transcend themselves,
Mhm.
either for a cause or for other people. And that activity, the meaning making, makes you feel alive, engaged, that your life is not wasted, that you are here for a reason. And that is the feeling of mattering that you get when you feel there is a meaningful activity, a meaningful connection. I'm not the only one saying that. My dear former professor and colleague Arye Kruglansky, a very famous social psychologist, Arye calls this the quest for significance theory, QST, quest for significance theory. And Arye Kruglansky says that a lot of the things we do in life are in the service of significance and mattering. Meaning, activity, meaningful activities is one of them.
Mhm. It makes me think a little bit of Julie Hayslip's research. So Julie is a doctor who studies nurses, amongst other things, and has looked very much at the relationship between meaning and mattering in the nursing profession. And one of the things that she has discovered, her shorthand, is that nurses, by and large, come into the profession because it's deeply meaningful. Their significance, the work itself seems very important and worthwhile. But they only stay in the profession if they feel like they matter, if they can actually add value and feel valued. Is that a good synthesis?
Absolutely. And you can extrapolate that to burnout, right? You can ask, why do they leave?
Hmm.
And teachers, nurses, doctors, and employees in many sectors, the reason they quit is not necessarily because the pay is not great or the benefits are not great, but because they feel neglected, forgotten, dismissed,
Hmm.
devalued. That is the primary reason people quit. So you can look at why do they stay? They stay because they matter. Why do they quit? They quit when they feel that they have stopped being feeling valued and having an opportunity to add value. When you have
Hmm.
somebody breathing down your neck and constraining your degrees of freedom at work, so you feel like I have no room for creativity here. All I'm doing is just following orders. So you are constrained. And when you are constrained, you become despondent and you eventually quit. And in the teaching profession, which I know when I was dean of school of education, I studied this topic a lot. You know, why do teachers quit? And that is one of the main reasons.
Hmm. I have all sorts of questions for you that maybe we'll get to in a bit in terms of, practical things that people can do to make sure that people feel like they matter. But I want to go back to something else that you talked about before. There's a statement that you sometimes make that I think is possibly one of the most profound statements in the field of positive psychology and community psychology that has truly impacted me, that has made it matters a great deal to me. And that statement is there's no wellness without fairness. What does that mean? And how does that relate to this topic of mattering at work?
So if you think about wellness as comprehensive well-being, I define wellness as a multidimensional construct. And different people have different components for wellness. There is PERMA from Seligman and SPIRE by Tal Ben Shahar, and there is the REEFs components, which you know very well, autonomy, mastery, self-determination. There are various theories in my mind. We developed a theory called I COPE, which stands for interpersonal, community, occupational, physical, psychological, and economic well-being. So what do I think this I COPE theory adds to the existing literature? I think it adds context. So well-being for me is not just intra-psychic, but also extra-psychic. It has to do with community, occupation, relationships, economics, etc. So I was trying to bring more context to the definition of wellness and well-being.
Mhm.
So the moment you think about work, economics, relationships, community, it's all about relationships. Working relationships, community relationships, social relationships. And those relationships can be experienced as fair or unfair. They can be experienced as just and respectful, and you feel like you're being treated with dignity, that your psychological DUE, what you deserve psychologically is being respected
Mm.
as a human being. So when interpersonal, community, economic domains of life, when you feel, oh, there is justice in these domains of life, your well-being goes up. And when there is no justice, when there is no economic justice, when there is no occupational justice, when there is no community justice because there is discrimination against gays and lesbians, against people with disabilities, against people from other races and ethnicities, then you don't experience justice in the community and your well being will go down.
Mm.
So we can try as hard as we want to promote wellness without fairness, but it will only help a few privileged people.
Mhm.
Those who have the privilege to ignore societal negative, detrimental circumstances. So, in other words, wellness without fairness is a privilege of the few. But if you think about social wellness, then you really have to pay attention
Mm.
to conditions of fairness. And to tie it back to mattering, as I was saying a few minutes ago, you can think of justice as a condition. So, are conditions of fairness prevalent at work or in society? Yes or no? To what degree? It's a condition. But then that condition is going to lead to a phenomenological experience, the felt experience of justice. What is that? Mattering. So the answer is, how does it feel like to be in just, fair, respectful, dignity building relationships? What does it feel like? Feeling valued and adding value.
Mhm.
So there is a lot of converging evidence, starting with attachment theory. When you think about what does a baby want, expect, wishes from the world? To feel valued, to be cared for. what do we want in relationships with our partners, with our co-workers? We want to be treated with dignity. And I go back to the psychological do. In justice, we talk to each his or her due, to each their due, DUE, what they deserve. So it turns out that justice can be an abstract concept. Oh yeah, what's procedural justice, distributive justice? These can be philosophical principles that guide policy.
Mhm.
But the psychological experience is very much felt in your bones. And that's what leads to well being.
These ideas are so important and they're also so challenging. One of the things, a data point that I think really supports what you were describing. I was recently listening to Shige Oishi, who is a wonderful well-being researcher who studies not, amongst many other things, has studied the relationship between how much money I make every year and how much well-being I might have. There's been huge amounts of debate over the years about this question. There was a very famous study at a certain point along the way that basically said, if you earn above a certain amount, that amount, I think at the time was about $75,000 a year in the US. If you earn above $75,000, the amount of increased money that you make doesn't necessarily have a great deal of relationship to your well-being. And that number has increased over the years. I think right now it's about $125,000 in the US. But there's been tremendous amount of controversy around this particular idea in the literature. Some people finding great amount of evidence for that, and some people finding no evidence for that. And what Shige has recently discovered is that if you plot the Gini coefficient of a country at a specific period of time and look at that relationship, you can see whether or not the amount of income inequality in a country is directly related to that belief that after a certain amount of money, there is less significance to the amount of money that you're earning relative to your well-being. And so this notion that the greater the amount of inequality, the more likely that you are going to be greatly affected by the amount of money you're making if you are poor versus if you are rich, versus in societies where there is very little income inequality. And in that situation, it matters a whole lot less. I say all of that because I think about the fact that at least in giant corporations right now, the income disparity between those in positions of power and leadership in organizations and the median employee, the average worker, is huge. I mean, in some cases, it's 670 to 1. The amount of inequality within just an organization can be absolutely huge. And so I'm wondering how you deal with that from there's no wellness without fairness perspective in an organization.
There is a lot of research showing that when Ronald Reagan started dismantling unions, the well being of employees in many industries went down significantly.
Hmm.
And if you think about not that all unions are great and that's the answer to everything, but unions do represent power for the people, especially in this country where workers in the US, don't have a ton of power. So you need protections, and
Mhm.
the unions try to protect their employees. We saw recently, as you know, the auto industry, they went on very long strikes, and actors and writers and healthcare workers and nurses and teachers in different parts of the country. Unfortunately, what is not given shall be demanded. So it's unfortunately when workers don't receive what they feel they deserve. And again, I know teachers well, again, because of my previous role. My son and my daughter in law were teachers for a few years. Now they're doing different things. My son now runs a chess organization. But when they were teachers, I know how hard they work and how hard their peers still work and how little compensation there is. So there must be protections. And if you look at other countries, that's always an interesting, as you were talking about the Gini coefficient. So I'm affiliated with a research center in Norway with the National University of Science and Technology, and I work quite closely with my colleagues in Norway. And I know that they pay a lot of taxes, but I also know that Norway is one of the happiest countries in the world. And they don't make a lot of money, but they're not complaining. And I don't see an exodus going from the Nordic countries, to more capitalist countries like the US. So, yes, what you're saying is that the Gini coefficient is really a proxy measure for feeling like you belong. Because the more inequality there is, the more you feel left out. Unless you're really, in the top, however percentage of the graph, you feel like you don't belong. And it's in your face all the time. So I live in Miami, one of the most unequal cities in the US. So there is extreme wealth and extreme poverty. And for those who are on the wrong end of the stick, they feel like they don't belong, so they don't matter. So again, I go back to the psychological phenomenology of mattering or not mattering and the relationship to equality and the Gini coefficient. So countries with a lower Gini coefficient, which means more equality, they report higher levels of happiness, higher levels of well-being, but again, not necessarily higher levels of wealth. So you can be less wealthy and more happy. So the mediating mechanism is like you feel like you belong. You,
Mhm.
I have an interesting anecdote. When I was in Norway many years ago, I was talking to a former psychiatric patient in recovery, and she was appalled that the Minister of Health was making, I think at the time it was like twice as much as she was making on a state pension. And she was appalled that a minister would be making twice as much as she was making on a state pension. That goes to show you, the level of commitment to equality, which is really admirable. Yeah, and I could give you many more stories about Argentina, which is really unfortunately not in a good shape, which is where I was born. And I could give you examples of Australia and Canada, where I lived many years. I could give you examples of the US and Norway. But the bottom line is when there is more justice, there is more happiness.
Mm. One of the things that I think is so important about what we're talking about is that the reality is that meaning and mattering at work is a complex thing, right? It's so easy for us as practitioners to think that the way in which we intervene is just at the individual level with an individual intervention. Help someone find more meaning in their work, and that's all you need to do. And so much of the research says there's a lot of complexity here. Yes, of course, the individual matters, but so does the way that their jobs are designed. And so does the way that they fit within an organizational context. So does what the values of that organization are, the policies of that organization, the way that leadership is exercised in that organization. But even beyond that, that organization fits into a broader system, a broader societal context. Whether that organization exists in Norway, as you're describing, or in Argentina, is going to make a really vast difference in terms of what that organization can do, in terms of what that individual is ultimately going to be faced with. And I think it can be really hard to try to figure out, well, what do I do if that's something that I feel like I can't control? I can't control anything about the society that I'm part of. What thoughts do you have about that feeling?
On one hand, you are correct that there are many external forces to any organization that are really shaking and shaping your organization. But on the other hand, people still have a lot of control of what happens within the organization. I think about Barry Wehmiller and Bob Chapman and what he did to create really an industrial complex based on mattering. Everybody Matters. That's the title of his
Good
book.
book.
Raj
Wonderful book.
Sisodia. Yes,
Yeah.
and Just to give you one example, or I think about Mondragon in Spain, the great cooperative in the Basque region, where people work together to weather economic storms. They work in a cooperative environment. So when there are economic downturns, everybody takes a pay cut, but nobody gets laid off. And there are many stories like that.
Hmm.
So I'm not asking managers, bosses to be heroic. I'm not asking superhuman behavior. No, really, I think this is within our reach. And if you just did a thought experiment and you asked employees in any company, what's really important to you? So, what are they going to tell you? They're going to tell you, well, benefits are important, pay is important, respect is important, relationships are important, creativity, psychological safety. So, they can give you a list of, I don't know, 6 to 8 things. If you do a qualitative analysis, you could probably shrink it to like 5 to 7 areas, right? That are really important for people at work. And then you ask yourself, okay, I'm the boss here. What can I do to create more fairness and more wellness and more mattering in all these domains of life? And sometimes it's as simple as starting with values clarification.
Hmm.
Sometimes people don't know what values lead their organization. So, again, if you ask a random group of employees, many of them will say, well, I want to be treated with respect. I want to have a say over what happens in my job. Once in a while, I want to take a leadership role. Or when I do something good, I want to be able to be told, hey, good for you, Andrew. So people will give you, that's data. And then you can ask yourself, okay, so what can I do to make more of it? It's some of it is hard, some of it it's not so hard.
Mhm.
So in our book, How People Matter, we have a couple of chapters on work and very concrete strategies on how to reward people, how to provide recognition to employees. For example, employees like public recognition. Employees like to be celebrated. And there is a whole list of criteria what makes for good recognition
Mhm.
and what makes for good teamwork. So there are very concrete things you can do to improve your value added. So, for example, in teams, we know this from work at MIT and Case Western and even Google with their Aristotle project. What leads for effective teamwork? First of all, high proportion of women in the team and very good interpersonal skills and the ability to share the microphone with your teammates. These are things you can do because when people exhibit more emotional intelligence, your peers feel valued. When they feel valued, they feel more creative. They don't have to defend themselves, like always be kind of covering your ass. Oh, what if I say the wrong things? So when you are free of these intrusions, psychological intrusions into your space, you are much more creative. So this is the broaden and build theory. So in short, there are a lot of things that can be done to create more value in your team, to pay more attention to your employees so they feel valued. And yes, to think about restructuring compensation in ways that people feel really honored and appreciated for their work. So I understand what you're saying about many external forces, but let's not undermine our own agency within the workplace and just say, oh, I have a board or all these economic trends. There's nothing I can do. I don't think that's true.
Hmm. One of the things that I truly love about what you've described here today in so many different ways is a focus on the collective, is on the focus of how much mattering is ultimately connected to a sense of belonging, to a sense of dignity and respect, the ways in which there's respectful engagement between people, the ways in which we think about the other is so much about what the fairness element of there's no wellness without fairness. You sometimes talk about the difference between me cultures and we cultures in organizations. And you've made it so clear today how we cultures are really the foundation of what mattering is all about, which is interesting because I think that for many people, meaning can sometimes be very me oriented. What's meaningful for me? What's my personal significance? What makes work worthwhile for me? There's often a pro social element to it, but it's still very me focused. There's so much of the mattering context you've talked about today that's very we focused. Do you have anything more to say about that?
Yes. Going back to the values that should guide our behavior at work, a lot of people use work, see work as a vehicle to their own advancement. So if I define the me culture for your listeners, so what's a me culture? The me culture is driven by the following precept. I have the right to feel valued so that I can be happy. So the emphasis is on I have the right to feel valued so that I can be happy. These are the four key elements. I, right, value, happy. What's a we culture? So a we culture says, alternatively, we all have a right and responsibility
Hmm.
to feel valued and add value to self and others so that we can all experience not just happiness and wellness, but also fairness. So all of a sudden, it's not just anymore about my right to be happy, but it's also rights and responsibilities. It's not just about feeling valued, but also about adding value, not just to myself, but also to others. And it's not just anymore about only happiness, but also about fairness.
Mhm.
So when you think about work, are you a manager that only looks for your next big job? Or are you managing app? Are you managing externally to polish your resume? Or are you really working on behalf of your people? Do you have a commitment to the we, like Bob Chapman does, and many others? You know, like he especially talks about mattering. That's why I talk about him. But there are so many others. So when I was dean of the School of Education and Human Development, one of the first things I did was there was always a faculty school council, you know, because faculty are privileged in universities. There was never a staff council.
Hmm.
So I created a staff council and I would meet once a month with all my staff to talk about what are the issues, what are their concerns, and it was huge for them because nobody before really wanted to learn what they worry about, what they are concerned about. And when I was vice provost for institutional culture, one of the most rewarding things I did, we ran workshops on feeling valued, adding value, culture of belonging. And I used to ask employees at the university, from surgeons and scientists to carpenters and gardeners, tell me, how do you add value to the university? And you could see their grin, and you could see their smiles, and you could see their moment in the sun. You know, it's like, oh, nobody asked me this before. Thank you for asking. So there are many things that can be done to not just put the light on you, but put the light on other people. Give them a chance to speak, give them a chance to shine. You will be, you as the asker, you will be rewarded tenfold. by the recognition you will get for giving recognition to other people.
Isaac, I feel like I could probably talk to you all day about these topics, possibly all week. But for the sake of this podcast, if there was one question that I should have asked you about mattering at work that I haven't, what would it be?
Maybe what is the one thing you can do tomorrow when you go back to work for you to feel like you matter and to help others feel like they matter?
What would you say?
By giving other people the gift of your time and listening so that they can feel seen and heard. Speak briefly just to ask a few open ended questions and ask non judgmental questions, ask curious questions, and really invest time in learning about your colleagues. And they will feel appreciated and respected and valued. And in return, you will feel rewarded by asking these questions.
Isaac, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast and for helping us make meaningful work and mattering matter. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity, Andrew, and thank you for your great work.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.